Hello, everyone. In this episode, the topic we are going to discuss is association and causation. And today we have a very special guest. We have Dr. Michelle Guerrero. So Michelle is a postdoctoral fellow at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. And I know that Michelle can sing and dance like Beyonce. So that's really awesome. And it is very exciting for me to have Michelle to our class today. We worked for a bit together, like about 1 month at CHIO. So it's great to see you again. So big welcome to the class, Michelle.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So do you want to introduce yourself to our students?
Sure. Yeah. So like you just mentioned, I'm a postdoc at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, working in the Healthy Active Living and Obesity group or research group. And I've been there for about 2 years, 9 months. Previously though, I'm not, my training and education isn't in public health and epidemiology. I did my master's and my PhD at the University of Windsor in exercise and physical activity psychology. So about 2 months, heading into the completion of my PhD, I applied to this position at Halo and I got it. So I ended my PhD, had 1 month off, and then started at Halo. And it's been fun.
Nice. Yeah, that's very interesting because none of the people that I talked to, they pursue the goal in the same field. They were all over the place, and same for me too. I did my PhD in health psych, exercise psychology. So it's very interesting. But what really got you to, I guess it just naturally happened, but advancing from being at the nexus between exercise psychology and epidemiology, like how did it all come together for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have always been interested in children's physical activity, healthy movement behaviors, that kind of stuff. But in my PhD, I really honed in on children's imagery in their physical activity and how they see themselves being active in non-organized sport settings and how that influences their confidence and their active play participation and stuff. So I've always had an interest in children's healthy movement behaviors, particularly physical activity. And then when this position came up, it was perfect because one of the main projects that I was tasked to do is work with you on children's engagement in forest and nature school. So I found the shift pretty natural and kind of coherent in somewhat way. In my PhD and master's, I looked at what's happening in children's minds regarding play. And then I moved into my postdoc and I started looking at what are they actually doing in their active play when they're outdoors and free to play.
So I guess the common theme was children's health and their health behavior, and that just got you to the place where you are right now.
Exactly.
Nice. Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks for giving us a bit of your background and your research interest. So as a postdoc right now, what kind of research are you conducting?
So my research varied globally: children's healthy movement behaviors, physical activity, sleep, screen time. But probably within the last year and a half, I've really honed in on children's screen time or digital media use. And so right now I'm looking at what are children doing online. And so I'm using data from self-report questionnaires, and I'm also using objective data. So what are kids actually doing on their smartphones or their tablets, which is really, really cool because for years, we've only been able to understand what children are doing via self-report. And so we're getting the frequency. How much time in the past 7 weeks have you spent, watching television or on your smartphone? But, a child can be on their smartphone and be doing multiple different things. And so what is the content? How are they engaging with their cell phone or their smartphone is different than how much time are they using, right? So I've really kind of taken this interest to social media and smartphone use, but then also I know you have a background in measurement and evaluation. I'm interested in how can we better assess children and youth smartphone use via questionnaires. So a lot of the questionnaires that we've been using for the past several years have been, relatively the same when we started measuring screen time in, mid 2000s. And screen time or digital media use has evolved so much. So to be using the same questionnaire today as we did, 12, 15 years ago is dangerous, not reflective. So I'm looking at, different screen time measures and how we can improve our questionnaires for assessing digital media use and content.
Nice. Yeah. Well, like even 5 years ago, we didn't have TikTok.
Insane. And now TikTok is skyrocketing for children.
Yeah, taking over. And I don't have the TikTok account, so I'm not the most timely person.
So I have downloaded so many different apps and games because I'm seeing that kids are using these apps and games. I've only done it because I need to understand why they're using it or what it's about. So I have to say, I was on TikTok last night and I have an account. I don't post, I don't follow anyone. I just scroll under the discovery. Yeah. And the content on TikTok is diverse. In a good way, diverse. That's how I'm putting it, diverse.
Yeah, nice. So well, before we get into the topic, I want to talk a little bit more about your research. So how do we objectively measure screen time, and is there any ethical issues doing that?
It's a great question. And I think we've taken so long to get here because of those issues that you just raised. Are we ethically allowed to go into someone's smartphone and see what they're using? So there's a few different ways we can measure it objectively. One is using an app. So, we might pull data from an iPhone just and look at the screen time data. There's updates that we get every Sunday. So I hate those. I hate those. As soon as it pops up, I'm like, click, I want it off. I want it. So we can use that, but that isn't, it isn't used very often in research studies. There's one device that I've looked into and that I've played around with for a research study, and it's called Circle. And so it's a little small box that plugs into a home router's, family router's internet. And you download the app, and it's primarily aimed for parents to monitor and control or limit their time. And this device is amazing in terms of content. So you can see how long the child was on specific platforms, which is something that we've never been able to do. TikTok, Instagram, Netflix. And we see now, especially in the past year, during the pandemic, people are spending so much more time on their mobile devices than any other device. So this device, Circle, uses or calculates a child's time spent on different platforms and how much time they're surfing and all that kind of stuff. So that's another way. But the data that I'm looking at right now is from the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. They recently, which is the longest, so it's ABCD study. It's the largest long-term study on child development and brain development in the United States. And so they recently implemented this system. I forget what it's called, but they've been able to track children's time on their screen time. So I'm pretty sure they gave an Android phone to children. And I am going through the data. So just to give you an idea, there's 130,000 data points that were pulled from the objective screen time data. And the stuff that these kids are doing, again, very diverse. So some apps are so harmless. Like there's a painting app, or there's, a drawing app, or there's an app where, you're in a snowplow and you have to snowplow the roads, stuff like that. But then there's all these other apps that kids are downloading that are mature rated or teen rated. And it's, not appropriate.
Yeah.
And they're engaging with this. So it's fascinating to see what they're actually doing online, because it's not self-report. And so you really get a glimpse, a snapshot of what they're doing on the device.
Wow. That's really interesting, because now we know screen time is not good for children's health, but we don't know what type of screen time. And we need to know that because everyone's engaging in screen time, like it's unavoidable, right? So knowing what type of apps or what kind of activities we do in front of a screen, that could really provide us more in-depth information about, developing public health policy around screen time. Like we cannot really say limit your screen time to 2 hours per day. Like that's not enough information.
That's just, and especially too, right now, I don't think it's good that we say that when kids are living in a pandemic. So let's just go back to the beginning of the pandemic in March, April, May, June, when kids were at home, they weren't going to school. I hope kids were on their devices, engaging, using FaceTime, using all these different platforms to connect with their friends. Otherwise, that can be very, very isolating for a child. So especially right now, I hope they're engaging in different types of screen time that can help them feel connected to their friends and classmates.
Right. So now it's like the generation is now that screen time is like necessity. It's not, something we can do during leisure time.
It's social currency for young people. If you are not on social media or your cell phone or your screen time, you are unlike the majority of your classmates and friends.
So, are you saying I'm old?
Listen, we're both old. Some of these things that are popping up, I'm like, what is this app? Like, I don't know. Yeah, I'm out of touch. Coming from a person too that just downloaded Instagram like maybe 2 years ago, I'm very out of touch.
Wow. It's shocking, but I guess, the things change. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for speaking more about your research. Now let's get into the topic. So we're talking about association and causation today. And so we have association and we have causation. Can you tell us the main difference between the two, Dr. Guerrero?
So an association is when there's a relationship or an association between an exposure variable and an outcome variable. Whereas a causality or a causal relationship is when there's a change in the exposure variable that results in a change in the outcome variable. So two different types of associations.
So I guess association, there's just simply they're associated, like there's an exposure and outcome and they're just related. Whereas causation, there's some causality. So one thing leads to the other.
Yeah, one thing leads to the other. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So can you give us some examples of each? So what type of relationship you can say association, and what type of relationship you can say there's causation?
Okay. So an example of a relationship that might be associated is, or an association is, higher screen time. I'm just going to place this into my research. Higher screen time is linked with greater depression in young people. That's an association. Those two variables, the exposure, screen time, or let's just say social media. I'm going to specify this. Social media is associated with higher levels of depression. Whereas, I'm not entirely sure. There's an experimental study showing this link. So when we think of causality or causal, we're looking at a change, or that the exposure variable was manipulated, and then the outcome variable was assessed. So an example of that would be, in my PhD work, we looked at children's imagery use. So we got children, we recruited children from elementary schools, and we divided children into two groups. One group was children who received the imagery intervention, and the other group just received children's short stories.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the intervention, we saw that children in the imagery group had higher levels of active play than children in the control group. So that is an example of where, we could draw some causality to the relationship between imagery use and active play participation.
Right. So, for example, like based on one cross-sectional study, like there's an association between screen time and depression, and screen time was the exposure and depression was the outcome. And even though we find that they're associated, we cannot really say that there's a causation between those two variables. Whereas, let's say we have experimental study design, so RCT, and there was like case and control or treatment versus control, and we control the exposure setting, then we follow them up and we measure their outcome and we see differences. Then we can maybe infer causality, but we need multiple studies and multiple evidence.
Exactly. I mean, even that one study, that means, nothing really. Mm-hmm. You need to, like you said, we need replication, and we need a bunch of other studies to, mimic and also introduce other variables that weren't considered initially. But yeah, exactly. Like you said, we need multiple studies to confirm that this predictor leads to this outcome.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. So to determine causality, we need multiple studies and to confirm and to back up our argument.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. Okay. So we covered association and causation. Now let's dig a little bit deeper into associations. So, in Epi course, I always teach to my students that there are three types of associations. So the first one is spurious, second one noncausal, third one causal. So can you tell us what each association indicates with some examples?
Sure. Yeah. So spurious associations, like you have in your slide, are false associations. So typically in this one, we'll have, a exposure and then an outcome, and they're only associated because of a third variable. So I'm just looking at your textbook, because I think that in the textbook they gave an excellent example. So there was a study that was done that looked at dietary intake and cancer across 60 different countries. So they found that there were multiple positive associations between these two things. But they said that these positive associations are purely due to chance, because there's these other factors that can play into the role. And we don't actually know if the exposure variable has a relationship with the outcome variable if we don't consider all these other variables. So these are false associations.
Mm-hmm. And, after this one, we're going to talk about bias and confounding after this topic. So I guess it's highly relevant because we talk about confounders, and, because chronic disease, there are multiple causes, not just one thing, physical activity or dietary habits or genetics, right? It's a combination of those things. So we need to really tease out the impact or association between one exposure and outcome by controlling other factors as well.
And if we think about that as researchers, that's really hard to do. Sometimes it's really hard to do to minimize bias. If we're recruiting a sample, is that sample diverse? We don't want the sample to be too specific. Are we using the right measurement tools? What other are we performing the analyses correctly? Have we controlled for other things that might impact the relationship? So limiting bias is a really hard thing to do. It can be done, obviously, but it requires a lot of thought in order to, okay, am I going to make this claim? Am I very confident that this association exists with how I limited these different biases?
Yeah, like like the question that we have all the time, like how much am I confident with this result? Like can can I, say that there's a causal relationship? So that's why, because it's based on, our judgment basically in determining causality. Yeah, that's a really good point. So we're gonna be speak about bias and confounding in the next class, but thanks for mentioning that. I think that's a really nice transition. And of course, determining causality and association, highly relevant with bias and confounding. And I tell my students that none of the studies is perfect.
No, and I think that's the thing, is to be aware that the studies that you run or that you're in charge of, they're going to be full of biases. The goal is to never ever eliminate all, because that's impossible. It's to reduce as many biases as you can. So no, when you're doing your own research, how can I limit the biases in my study? But also when I'm evaluating another study or a peer-reviewed paper, how can I be aware of any biases that other researchers may not be aware of, or acknowledge the biases that they did in the limitation section?
Right. Wow. Dr. Guerrero speaks to your experience. My gosh, now we can talk about peer review. Yeah. So we also have a topic about critical appraisal of epidemiological research. And yes, it is important that we critically appraise each study, because we have all different types of biases and confounding in every study. And we need to make sure that we know, we can identify that. And also we are able to control for those, to minimize biases that we could have in our study.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. So we talked about spurious and kind of non-causal and causal too, but can you give us one example of non-causal association?
Yeah, and Dr. Lee, I'm going to go to your chapter again, because I just think your chapter was excellent in terms of really explaining. So in your chapter, they talk about how non-causal associations may exist may also exist when the defined exposure results from the outcome. So here they talk about hypertension may result in kidney disease. But there may also be association between the two. Hypertension would not be considered a cause of kidney disease because the exposure does not precede the outcome and therefore cannot alter its frequency.
Right.
And so, I think non-causal is, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is the type of association that we would more often see. Would you agree in our reading?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think most findings that we have, because we cannot be ever sure, like it's so unfortunate, but we cannot be ever sure. But there are multiple factors and we try to identify all those things. So I think currently the evidence that we have is mostly non-causal association. And, among those, we can identify some of the causal associations, right? So for example, like smoking and lung cancer, for sure, like that's the basis of epidemiology. So we know that cigarette smoking is associated with lung cancer, and we see like odds ratio of more than 100. So, then we can maybe confidently say, yes, cigarette smoking leads to lung cancer. But other than that, like we're not really sure. And even smoking and lung cancer, is it really smoking or low income that's associated with cigarette smoking, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
And
non-causal too, when you were like, non-causal relationships are, they question whether that, if the exposure variable is removed, so if, people get lung cancer even when they don't smoke. So, so what, really be confident.
Yeah, exactly. Like, like somebody who didn't smoke and they get lung cancer, then how can we explain that, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. So now we covered spurious, non-causal, and causal association. So let's move on to Bradford Hill's criteria in determining causality. So, there are certain criteria that we can use to determine causality because it's about researchers' confidence it's about making judgment. So someone has to make judgment and so we need some criteria to be sure, to be confident, because, the point of epidemiology is also turn our knowledge into practice. So we have to be cautious because we don't want to make bad policy, of course. Yeah. So there are 9 criteria, and I want to specifically discuss only 4 the main very important criteria. So that's temporality, strength of association, consistency, and dose response relationship. And we alluded to each point in our conversation, but let's go over from the top. So temporality, directionality, what does that mean?
Okay, so temporality is the exposure in question. So the independent variable or the predictor must precede the disease.
I see.
This is like in your slide, it's the number one thing that must be present in order to determine causality. And if we think about, a lot of research studies, especially in my line of research, when I'm looking at social media or screen time and health outcomes, I think one of the first limitations that authors cite in their limitation section of the paper is we cannot determine whether social media causes depression because it was assessed at both the same time. So that in that case, if you're assessing social media and depression at the same time, the exposure doesn't precede the outcome. So a perfect example of we cannot determine if it's causal.
Right. Yeah, I never thought about that. But yeah, the first thing that we mentioned in limitation is that this study cannot infer causality. Like I would just say it without even thinking. But I guess that really speaks to its importance. So the most important criterion, and thanks for mentioning that, is temporality. So the exposure condition should precede the outcome.
Yeah. And to Dr. Lee, when we talk about causality and we're talking about, something causing something else, we as researchers too, I think, have to be super, super mindful of the language that we're using. When I say social media influences mental health outcomes, that word influences is immediately associated with causality. So I don't know if you've had this when you're reviewing papers or people reviewing your work, we attack those instances where people are using this causality language when you have a cross-sectional study.
Yeah, for sure. So we want to avoid, even though our studies are CT, maybe we want to avoid using strong causal language because it's just one study.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, and I talked to my dad and I'm like, oh, so Dad, I think screen time is associated with bad health outcomes. So maybe you should reduce your screen time. The next thing that he's going to do, and he meet his friends and he's going to say, my daughter is a doctor. And he says, she says, screen time is bad for your health. So then that becomes causality.
But that is, and that, exactly like that. But media also picks up on that. So it's your dad, it's my sister, it's media, it's documentaries that are picking up on this really, really strong statement.
Yeah, and screen time is such a hot topic right now. So, the media will pick up. And actually, students are currently doing the assignment on news story. That's based on epidemiological research. So there are all different types of news that you will see. Yeah. Wow, interesting. And okay, so the next one, strength of association. What does this indicate, Dr. Guerrero?
Okay, so when we have an association that's a strong association, and we have multiple studies that can kind of confirm this strong association, then we can more or less be somewhat confident that it is a causal relationship, that something here is existing, that it's potentially present, that the predictor or the exposure causes the outcome.
I see. So with temporality, if we see a strong association and, students are getting used to odds ratios and relative risk. So let's say, we see odds ratio of 100, then maybe we can be confident. We can be a bit more confident than looking at odds ratio of 1.5.
Right.
Yeah.
And to talk to looking at a study from a broad perspective, these are the things that you have to look at. Association, strength of association. If multiple studies are reporting a very, very small association between X variable and Y variable, okay, that's something to consider. But if there's multiple studies and rigorous studies that are showing these large associations between X and Y, then, okay, wow, we can really, move past that level of like, is it skepticism, where you say, okay, is this a causal relationship?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's also associated with, I guess, consistency that we're going to talk about. So we can move on. So what's consistency? And it says replication of the findings. So can you tell us about that too?
Yeah. So consistency and replication in science right now, I think, is a huge topic. And it's something that we are all searching towards, is to be a little bit more consistent in the research findings that we're producing or publishing. So, replication is replicating these studies over and over again. So let's just say social media and depression. So there's been quite a bit of studies showing that there is a negative link between social media and depression. So the more social media you use, the higher levels of depression you have. So one thing I'd like to consider, or I'd like to point out too here for the consistency, is I like your point for the different populations or study designs. A lot of social media or screen time papers show, the association between screen time or social media and mental health is very, very small. But here's the difference when researchers really dig deep. Social media and depression, there's a stronger association for girls than boys. So I think consistency is important, and consistency among considering different things, age groups. Social media and depression is also stronger for younger girls than older girls. So, not only being consistent, but in the specific populations and genders and study designs is important.
Right. So it's just not about one big population that we are talking about. Sometimes it could be inconsistent between different population groups. So then we need to look at different age groups, different sex groups, different gender groups.
That kind of thing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, so lastly, now we can discuss dose response relationship. And I guess we hear this a lot in drug trials. So can you explain what this is and maybe an example as well?
Sure. Yeah, this dose response relationship refers to when there's the more exposure should theoretically lead to a greater effect. So a perfect example of this is social media. The higher social media users, the more at risk they are to experience higher levels of depression. And this is evident in research. We don't see a huge relationship between social media and depression in light or moderate users. We do see that dose response, though. When you get into the high social media users, then we see that really skyrocket that relationship where there's higher levels of depression.
So the association between exposure and the outcome is kind of incremental or detrimental. But so, Dr. Guerrero, are you saying that low to medium levels of screen time exposure is fine for us? Am I getting validation here?
No. I'm saying that based on the research for young kids, we know that there's a dose response relationship for girls and heavy users and young girls.
I see. So then I still need to, what do I need to do with my high screen time every day.
You need to turn off Netflix and stop watching, what's a popular one? Queen's Gambit? I haven't watched the entire one, but I've heard it's wonderful.
Yeah, that's old. I'm watching Bridgerton right now.
Oh yeah, I can't get into that. I don't like that type, and the Queen. Okay, I know I might get a lot of back. I just can't get into it. I don't know what it is.
With the Crown?
The Crown. See, I don't even know. I don't even know the name. It's so crappy in my eyes that I just don't even know the name.
Wow, you're doing well. I watched everything.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, that's awesome. So we determining causality. It's important that we consider all 4 things. So temporality, strength of association, consistency, and dose-response relationship. But out of all, temporality is the most important one.
The key. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So talking about association and causation, is there anything that we're missing?
Wow, that's a tough question.
Are we missing a lot of things?
No, you're not. No, you're not. I think the chapter and your slides do a wonderful job of providing students with the knowledge needed to assess peer-reviewed articles, but also to design and to make sure that you're interpreting your research findings correctly.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I want to mention, so your paper, I'm gonna put this up as the reading.
Okay.
So the title is Screen Time and Problem Behaviors in Children, Exploring the Mediating Role of Sleep Duration. So in terms of association and causality, what are we testing in this paper?
We are testing whether there's an association. We are not testing whether there's causality. So the screen time served as the exposure. Problem behaviors, which were things like aggressive behavior or depression, served as the outcome variables. And then we also threw a third variable in there, which was sleep duration. So we said, okay, is screen time associated with problem behaviors? One. And is also screen time through sleep duration, is that associated with problem behaviors? And we did find that sleep duration mediated the effects of screen time and problem behaviors. So we're looking at purely associations here.
Mm-hmm. So, but what it suggests is that, those who engage in excessive screen time may lack sleep. So that may turn into problematic behavior. Is that correct understanding?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the mediating relationship that you just mentioned. So high screen use is associated with less sleep, which may be associated with more problem behaviors. I
see. So then, this is testing the association, but if we have more studies like this, and if we find consistent findings, then maybe, we can validate this association, and maybe we can say there's a causality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I will be critical of my own work because that's always fun to do. I really don't like the term screen time. I think it's dangerous. I think screen time isn't equal. If I'm on my phone playing chess or on YouTube learning how to bake a cake or something like that, that's different screen time than engaging in hours of scrolling on social media or Instagram, something like that. So I don't like how we just throw this term out there, screen time. I think that that's dangerous when you say screen time and problem behaviors, because it's not, screen time definitely plays a role, but when we're talking about problem behaviors, research is showing that likely it's the corporate is social. The one to blame, the platform to blame is social media. So anyways, I'm just criticizing my own work. Using screen time as a global term can be dangerous.
I think that's a really important point, and maybe really important thing to think about when we do another terminology project on sedentary behavior.
I think so too. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
It's something that I should collaborate on.
Yeah, that's awesome. Wow. Okay. Well, thanks, Dr. Guerrero, for coming in today and speaking with us.
Thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun.
Amazing. Thanks.